The spread of prostitution and immorality by the Ottoman Turks in the countries they ruled. Despite the Ottomans' attempts to promote themselves as guardians of Sharia, they found themselves in stark contradiction to this claim. After forming an unholy alliance with the institution of Sheikh al-Islam, Sultan Selim I and his son Suleiman issued decrees legalizing prostitution and granting it imperial patronage, thereby establishing it as an officially licensed profession in exchange for collecting protection fees. The Ottomans harbored the Bektashi order and relied on it to secure the support of non-Muslim populations under their occupation. They promoted its licentious ideology to dismantle the cohesive societies they sought to conquer and control. They officially sanctioned practices such as adultery and gender intermixing, terming these acts the rank of companionship, Muratib al-Muzabah, which signified fraternization between men and women, aiming to strip these practices of the stigma of prostitution. In 1565, the first official case of prostitution was recorded when residents of Anatolia filed a lawsuit before a judge against 50 prostitutes, accusing them of operating brothels. In response, the prostitutes lodged a complaint with Grand Vizier Mehmed Sokollu Pasha. The case was deliberated with the Sultan to devise a legal framework to regulate prostitution. Ultimately, a decree was issued permitting them to join the Guild of Dancers, Ta'ifat al-Rakazat, thereby legitimizing their activities under this sanctioned institution. The rulers of the Caliphate turned a blind eye to the enforcement of Sharia rulings and abolished punishments for prostitution-related crimes, enacting laws and regulations to normalize and legalize adultery. In 1512, Sultan Selim issued legislation to regulate prostitution, establishing fixed tariffs for prostitution services based on social class and stipulating the state's share of the revenue. These laws provided a legal cover for moral dissolution and funneled vast sums of money into the state treasury. Continuing the series of glaring contradictions, Sultan Suleiman the lawgiver exposed the corrupt underbelly of the Sultanate when he issued the Sanjak of the Gypsies law in 1531, which regulated the affairs of prostitutes. Among its provisions was the mandatory payment of a monthly fee of 100 oxa by women from Edirne, Philippopolis, and Sofia engaged in illicit activities, a Mulgar Sharia. Suleiman the Magnificent summoned Sheikh al-Islam Abu Sa'ud Effendi, the empire's chief jurist, to deliberate on an urgent fatwa. Citing Bektashi Sufi doctrines, he argued for expanding personal freedoms, including gender mixing, to replenish state coffers drained by prolonged wars. Despite violating Islamic law, Abu Sa'ud endorsed the policy, issuing a fatwa that annulled the legal penalty for adultery in exchange for state-collected fees, thereby weaponizing religious authority to institutionalize moral compromise for fiscal gain. The Ottoman court in Istanbul normalized sexual exploitation under the veneer of the harem, where the Sultan maintained hundreds of enslaved women, jawari, for his personal gratification. Many were abducted from occupied European territories under the guise of the Difsherm, child levy tax, while others were offered as gifts by corrupt officials seeking political favor. This state-sanctioned system of coerced concubinage blurred lines between imperial authority, sexual predation, and institutionalized human trafficking, entrenching the palace's reputation as a hub of moral decay. The Ottoman bloodline was tainted by systemic prostitution, but the greater scandal lay in the sultanas' and sultans' mothers' illicit affairs with palace servants and enslaved individuals, even as sultans themselves openly engaged in sexual acts with concubines. Historian Ahmet Abdulrahim Mustafa notes in his book In the Origins of Ottoman History that Sultana Hürrem was embroiled in scandal for her relationship with Moses Aman, the Jewish physician of Suleiman the Magnificent, and an Armenian servant accused of being the biological father of Sultan Selim II, exposing the dynasty's moral hypocrisy and entanglement in sexual exploitation. Prostitutes operated freely across Istanbul and Ottoman provinces, granted unprecedented rights under governors who weaponized Sheikh al-Islam's fatwa to systematize the trade. From the 16th century onward, registries, numerical codes, and state-issued certificates were created to regulate sex workers, ensuring their exploitation generated revenue. This institutional framework not only legalized vice but actively promoted it, transforming moral decay into a bureaucratized pillar of Ottoman governance. The Ottoman Empire formally institutionalized prostitution as a state-regulated craft, categorizing sex workers under titles such as al-Muvaniyat, entertainers, mamisat, prostitutes, and banat al-Katwa wal-Hawa, women of leisure. A supervisory officer, Sabashi, was appointed to license brothels, enforce compliance through the collection of karta, scrap tax, revenues, and grant legal immunities to practitioners. Military units were tasked with safeguarding these operations, embedding systemic moral corruption into imperial governance structures while consolidating bureaucratic control over marginalized populations. The Ottoman Empire commanded its governors to promote prostitution and expand the number of karakanat, brothels. Underage girls engaged in sex work were barred from leaving the profession, as governors rejected repentance, deeming it a distraction from obedience and a violation of the profession's terms. Any girl who ceased practicing prostitution faced severe penalties, reinforcing the state's systemic exploitation of vulnerable populations to institutionalize vice. The Ottoman Empire feared Iraq province's potential alignment with the Safavid Empire and sought to weaken it by diverting attention from politics and religion. Turkish policy relied on state-sanctioned vice, orchestrated by provincial governors. Under the guise of promoting art, singing, and dance, governors personally supervised brothels, karakanat, and established a government-run prostitution network. With 150 state-affiliated pimps recruiting clients across cities, Baghdad became a sprawling hub for over 1,000 registered sex workers. This systematic corruption unraveled Iraqi society's moral fabric, eroding communal ties and plunging youth into decadence. In Damascus, the Ottoman state organized a regulated guild of prostitutes under Governor Asad Pasha al-Azm. He established government-run brothels termed public establishments, hosted lavish soirees and debauched gatherings, and assembled sex workers for special occasions under red tents. These events were promoted through public parades in Damascus markets. Damascene religious scholars publicly condemned these practices, expressing deep disapproval of the state's involvement in such activities.